December 7, 1941. Pearl Harbor. A quiet Sunday morning that permanently changed the course of world history. Japanese aircraft appeared in the skies over Hawaii without warning and launched a devastating assault on the United States Pacific Fleet. In just a few hours, 8 American battleships were sunk or heavily damaged. More than 2,400 Americans were killed. The Pacific Fleet was crippled. In Tokyo, Japanese military leaders celebrated. From their perspective, this was a perfect opening strike. They believed they had neutralized the American Navy and bought themselves the time they needed to secure victory. The war, in their minds, had just become winnable. But they had missed something critical. That morning, 3 American aircraft carriers were not at Pearl Harbor. They were out at sea. They survived. And at the same time, in places like Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Seattle, American factories were already preparing to shift into full wartime production. Assembly lines were being redesigned. Workers were being mobilized. Women, immigrants, and retirees would soon begin producing weapons, ships, and aircraft at a scale the world had never seen before. Japan believed it had won the first move. They had no idea what was coming. Before going further, it helps to ask a simple question. Could Japan have actually won the Pacific War? Or was December 7, 1941 the moment they sealed their fate? At first glance, the attack looked brilliant. But the deeper you look, the more complicated the answer becomes. To understand why Japan made this decision, you have to understand the situation they were trapped in. Japan was running out of time. By 1941, Japan had been fighting a brutal war in China for 4 years. It was a grinding conflict with massive casualties and no clear end in sight. More importantly, it was draining Japan's most critical resource, oil. Japan had very little domestic oil production. About 80% of its oil came from imports, and most of that oil came from the United States. This meant America held quiet control over Japan's military future. In July 1941, after Japan occupied French Indochina, President Franklin D. Roosevelt made a decisive move. He froze Japanese assets in the United States. Britain and the Dutch government in exile quickly followed. The result wasn't just sanctions. It was a total oil embargo. Overnight, Japan's fuel lifeline was cut. Japan's military calculated that it had enough oil reserves for maybe 18 months of operations. After that, the ships would stop moving. The planes would stop flying. The entire Imperial Japanese Navy would be stuck in port, powerless. That left Japan with 2 choices, and both of them were dangerous. The first option was to withdraw from China and negotiate with the United States. That would mean abandoning years of fighting, admitting failure, and humiliating the military government. Politically, this was almost impossible. The military leadership believed that retreat would collapse their authority. The second option was to gamble. Instead of backing down, they could expand. They could seize the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies, secure the resources they desperately needed, and accept the risk of war with the United States. But there was a major obstacle in the way. If Japan moved south toward the oil fields, the United States would almost certainly intervene. American forces in the Philippines sat directly across Japan's supply routes. The U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor had the ability to strike Japanese convoys and battle groups. Japan could not safely move into Southeast Asia without first dealing with American power in the Pacific. That is why they chose to strike first. The architect of this plan was Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of Japan's combined fleet. Yamamoto was not reckless. He had studied in the United States. He had attended Harvard. He had served as a naval attaché in Washington. He understood America better than most Japanese officers. He also understood something uncomfortable: Japan could not win a long war against the United States. In 1940, he warned Japan's political leadership with brutal honesty. He said that if war came, he could guarantee success for the first 6 months. After that, he had no confidence in the outcome. He understood the numbers. America had roughly twice Japan's population. Its economy was several times larger. Its industrial base was overwhelming. American steel production alone dwarfed Japan's entire industrial output. But Japan's military planners believed they had a narrow window. They didn't plan to conquer the United States. They didn't plan to invade California. Their strategy was based on psychology, not conquest. The plan was simple in theory. Cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet at the start. By 6 to 12 months. In that time, seize the Dutch East Indies, Malaya, the Philippines, Guam, and Wake Island. Build a defensive perimeter of fortified islands across the Pacific. When the Americans tried to fight back, they would face long supply lines, heavily defended island positions, and an experienced Japanese fleet. The casualties would be enormous. The cost would be politically painful. And eventually, the planners believed, America would choose to negotiate. This entire strategy depended on one critical assumption, that Americans would not tolerate a long, bloody war in the Pacific. That they would see the cost and choose compromise over total victory. That assumption would prove to be the most catastrophic miscalculation in modern military history. The attack itself was executed with terrifying precision. Before dawn, Japanese carriers launched more than 180 aircraft from roughly 230 miles north of Oahu. At 7:48 a.m., the first bombs began to fall. Torpedo bombers raced in low over the water. Dive bombers screamed down from the clouds. Battleship Row turned into a wall of fire, smoke, and twisted steel. The USS Arizona was struck by a bomb that penetrated into its ammunition magazine. The explosion that followed ignited more than 1 million pounds of stored ammunition. In minutes, 1,177 crew members were dead. The USS Oklahoma was hit by multiple torpedoes and rolled over. Hundreds of sailors were trapped inside the hull, many of them suffocating in the dark metal tomb. Within 2 hours, 8 battleships were sunk or disabled. Nearly 200 American aircraft were destroyed on the ground. Japan lost fewer than 30 planes. In purely tactical terms, it looked like a masterpiece. But the seeds of failure were already there. Japan had sunk ships, but it had not destroyed the infrastructure. The massive fuel storage tanks at Pearl Harbor were untouched. The dry docks that could repair ships were intact. The submarine base, which would later devastate Japanese shipping, was fully operational. Most importantly, the American aircraft carriers had escaped. The political impact was immediate and absolute. Before the attack, the American public was deeply divided about entering the war. After it, there was no debate left. The country unified overnight. The next day, President Roosevelt addressed Congress and asked for a declaration of war. The Senate voted almost unanimously. The House of Representatives passed the resolution by an overwhelming margin. One member voted no. That was it. America was no longer undecided. America was committed. And once the United States commits to a war, it does not look for a way out. It looks for total victory. After Pearl Harbor, the nature of the war changed instantly. Japan believed it had shattered American strength in the Pacific. In reality, it had awakened something far more dangerous. The United States did not respond with hesitation or fear. It responded with organization, coordination, and industrial force on a scale Japan had never imagined. The core issue was never bravery. It was math. Modern war is not just fought by soldiers. It is fought by factories. It is fought by railroads, oil refineries, steel mills, and assembly lines. Battles are decided by tactics, but wars are decided by production. And in that arena, the numbers were brutally one-sided. In 1941, the United States produced roughly 75 million tons of steel every year. Japan produced about 7 million. That is not a small difference. That is not a competitive gap. That is a structural impossibility. In a single month, American industry could outproduce an entire year of Japanese steel production. Every ship, tank, aircraft, and artillery shell depended on that steel. From the first day of the war, Japan was fighting an opponent that could replace losses faster than they could be inflicted. Oil told an even harsher story. The United States was producing more than 1 billion barrels of oil per year. The oil fields in Texas, California, and Oklahoma were producing at a rate that barely slowed even under wartime demand. Japan, by contrast, had virtually no domestic oil. Before the war, it had relied on foreign imports. After the embargo, it was desperate. Even when Japan captured oil fields in the Dutch East Indies, the reality did not improve. Allied engineers sabotaged wells and refineries before retreating. It took months to restore production. Worse, Japan did not have enough tanker ships to transport the oil back to the home islands efficiently. And American submarines quickly turned Japanese shipping lanes into death traps. Japanese tankers were sunk faster than they could be replaced. Population numbers made the imbalance even clearer. The United States had more than 130 million people. Japan had roughly 70 million. That meant America had nearly double the workforce, double the pool of potential soldiers, and far greater depth in manufacturing and logistics. The American economy was not just slightly larger. It was several times the size of Japan's. But nothing makes the difference clearer than aircraft production. Between 1941 and 1945, American factories built approximately 354,000 aircraft. Fighters, bombers, torpedo planes, transport aircraft, patrol planes. 354,000. Japan, in the same period, built about 76,000. The scale is hard to properly understand. In 1944 alone, the United States built roughly 96,000 aircraft in a single year. That 1 year of American production exceeded Japan's total wartime output. Japan's best production year was around 28,000 aircraft. Every single year, American factories were outproducing Japan by 3 to 4 times. The same story appeared at sea. From 1941 to 1945, the United States launched roughly 147 aircraft carriers of all types. Fleet carriers, light carriers, escort carriers. Japan built around 18. While Japan struggled to complete a handful of new carriers, American shipyards were laying down entire classes of ships simultaneously. In 1943, Japan had 3 carriers under construction. At that exact same time, American yards had more than 20 Essex-class fleet carriers being built. The United States was not trying to catch up. It was overwhelming the field. And carriers were only part of the picture. The United States mass-produced cargo vessels known as Liberty ships. Over 2,700 of them were built. These ships carried food, fuel, ammunition, soldiers, tanks, and aircraft across oceans. On average, American shipyards launched a new ship every couple of days for 4 straight years. Japan could not come close to this pace. Not in ships. Not in raw materials. Not in trained manpower. This was not a close contest hidden behind dramatic battles. It was a structural mismatch. Japan's entire strategy depended on one assumption, that the United States would get tired and quit. There was historical logic behind this belief. In 1904 and 1905, Japan had fought the Russian Empire. Russia was larger. It had more people, more land, more raw resources. But after Japan crushed the Russian Baltic Fleet at the Battle of Tsushima, Russia chose to negotiate. The war was expensive. The Russian public was exhausted. The Tsar agreed to peace. Japanese planners believed the same pattern would play out against the United States. They thought the Americans, once faced with high casualties and long distances, would negotiate to avoid further bloodshed. They misunderstood American political culture. Pearl Harbor did not make the American public want to compromise. It made them want to fight. The attack was viewed not as a legitimate military action, but as a betrayal. A surprise strike while diplomatic talks were still ongoing. It created a sense of national unity that Japan did not anticipate and did not prepare for. There was another layer of complexity that made Japan's situation even worse. Japan was not fighting an isolated United States. Germany was fighting the Soviet Union in Europe. Britain was still in the war. Japan's leadership assumed that Germany would tie down most of Britain and the Soviet Union, giving Japan freedom to operate in Asia. That balance collapsed almost instantly. Just days after Pearl Harbor, Germany declared war on the United States. Suddenly, the war became global. America was now fighting not only Japan, but also Germany and Italy. This should have been good news for Japan in theory, because American attention would be divided. In reality, it made things worse. American planners made a critical strategic decision. They adopted a Germany-first policy. Defeat the most dangerous enemy in Europe first, while holding Japan in the Pacific. That meant Japan was fighting what was essentially a secondary front against a fraction of American power. And Japan was still falling behind. The uncomfortable truth was this: the war was mathematically unwinnable long before many of the famous battles were fought. Once the United States fully mobilized its economy, the outcome was locked in. The only variable left was time. But war is not only numbers. It is also mistakes. And Japan would soon make the one mistake it could not recover from. By mid-1942, Japan's early momentum began to slow. The victories had been real. The Philippines had fallen. Malaya was under Japanese control. Singapore had surrendered. The Dutch East Indies were occupied. On paper, Japan had built a massive Pacific empire in just a few months. But the foundation of that empire was fragile. Everything depended on eliminating the American aircraft carriers. Those carriers were the key to the future of the war. As long as they existed, Japan could not operate freely. So Japan planned a decisive operation. A battle that would destroy American carrier power once and for all. The target was Midway Island. Midway sat about 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii. It was small, isolated, and strategically vital. If Japan could capture it, they could threaten Hawaii directly and force the remaining U.S. carriers into a fight. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto assembled the most powerful naval force Japan had ever built. For fleet aircraft carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, hundreds of aircraft. The plan was precise. Lure the Americans out. Trap them. Destroy them. But Japan made a fatal mistake. They assumed the operation was secret. American intelligence had broken Japanese naval codes. U.S. analysts knew the attack was coming. They knew the target. They knew the timing. This meant that when the Japanese fleet moved toward Midway, the American carriers were already positioned and waiting. The United States had 3 carriers in the area: Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown. Yorktown had been badly damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea. Under normal conditions, it would have taken months to repair. Instead, repair crews worked around the clock. They cut out damaged sections. They patched wiring. They reinforced structural damage. In just a few days, Yorktown was sent back into battle. On June 4, 1942, the battle began. In the early hours, Japanese aircraft launched strikes against Midway Island. They caused damage, but they did not destroy the facilities. Meanwhile, American carrier aircraft were searching for the Japanese fleet. Then everything turned. American dive bombers found the Japanese carriers at the worst possible moment. Japanese crews were in the middle of rearming and refueling their aircraft. The flight decks were packed with fueled planes, bombs, and torpedoes. It was the most dangerous state a carrier could be in. In a matter of minutes, 3 Japanese carriers were hit. Akagi, Kaga, Sarayu. Fires spread instantly. Explosions followed. The ships became floating infernos. A 4th carrier, Hiryu, was destroyed later that same day. In one day, Japan lost the heart of its carrier force. Over 250 aircraft were gone. more than 3,000 sailors and aircrew were dead. Among them were some of the most experienced pilots and mechanics in the Japanese Navy. These were not easily replaceable men. The United States lost one carrier, Yorktown, and a single destroyer. The balance of the war changed in a single afternoon. But the true damage was not just the ships. It was the experience that was lost. Ships can be built. Steel can be shaped. Engines can be assembled. But pilots take years to develop. Before the war, Japanese naval pilots were among the best trained in the world. In 1941, the average Japanese carrier pilot entered combat with about 700 hours of flight time. They were disciplined, precise, highly skilled. At the start of the war, American pilots averaged about 150 hours. Japan had the quality advantage. But quality alone is fragile when it cannot be replaced. After Midway, Japan ran into a crisis it could not solve. It no longer had time. Training programs were cut short. Standards were lowered. New pilots were rushed into service. By 1944, new Japanese pilots were graduating with as little as 40 hours of flight time. Some barely knew how to land on a carrier deck. Meanwhile, the opposite was happening in the United States. As the war progressed, American training became longer and more professional. By mid-1944, American carrier pilots were flying into combat with more than 500 hours of training on average. They were not just numerous. They were becoming highly skilled. This difference exploded into public view during the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944. Japan launched a massive carrier strike. 9 carriers. Hundreds of aircraft. They faced American forces defending the Mariana Islands. But the contest was not real. American carriers were equipped with radar. They could detect incoming aircraft at long range. Fighters were launched early. Defensive formations were organized calmly and efficiently. The Japanese waves flew straight into a wall of American fighters. American pilots flew the new F-6F Hellcat. These aircraft were fast, durable, and heavily armed. The results were devastating. In 2 days, Japan lost more than 600 aircraft. 600. That was more aircraft than Japan could build in a full year, even at peak wartime production. American losses were around 120 aircraft. American pilots called the battle the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. It felt less like combat and more like target practice. By this point, Japan's naval air power was effectively dead. The carrier fleet still existed on paper. Ships still floated. Flags still flew. But the experienced pilots were gone. The mechanics were overworked. The replacement parts were scarce. The aircraft were obsolete. The United States Navy, by contrast, was growing stronger every month. By the end of 1944, the U.S. Navy had become an unstoppable machine. New ships arriving constantly. New aircraft rolling off factories every day. Battle-hardened pilots backed by endless replacements. Japan had lost the ability to recover. From that point forward, the war was not about winning. It was about how long Japan could survive. By 1945, the outcome of the Pacific War was no longer in question. The only remaining question was how long it would take and how much destruction would be required before Japan accepted reality. The imbalance that had existed in 1941 had become overwhelming by the final year of the war. Japan's economy was exhausted. Factories were operating around the clock, but they no longer had the raw materials they needed. Steel was scarce. Rubber was scarce. Fuel was critically scarce. Civilian production had essentially disappeared. There were no reserves left to draw from. Everything was already being consumed by the military machine, and still it was not enough. The United States was operating in a completely different reality. By 1945, more than half of all industrial production in the world was happening inside the United States. American factories were not slowing down. They were accelerating. Shipyards were launching new vessels faster than Japanese shipyards could even lay keels. Aircraft plants were producing fighters and bombers by the thousands. Training programs were expanding, not shrinking. This is the reality that decided the war. Japan's original strategy was built on the idea that the United States would not tolerate a long war. That the political cost would become too high. That public opinion would shift. That negotiations would eventually happen. That calculation failed completely. The United States did not view the war as optional. After Pearl Harbor, it was viewed as a moral and national mission. The goal was no longer compromise. It was unconditional surrender. Even if Japan had won individual battles, the structure of the conflict made the final outcome almost inevitable. This was no longer a war of tactics. It was a war of replacement. Could Japan replace ships as fast as the United States? No. Could Japan replace trained pilots as fast as the United States? No. Could Japan produce steel, oil, aircraft, and transport vessels at a comparable scale? Not even close. Even hypotheticals fail under the weight of the math. If Japan had won the Battle of Midway, the United States would have adjusted. Shipyards would have accelerated production. Training pipelines would have expanded. The Americans would have taken losses, buried their dead, and kept building. The industrial base behind the American war effort was effectively untouchable. No strategic bombing campaign could reach it. No naval blockade could choke it. It was protected by geography, scale, and sheer economic depth. Japan never had that advantage. By the final months of the war, the Imperial Japanese Navy still existed on paper. There were ships that technically belonged to it. There were units that still carried its name. But as a fighting force, it had been hollowed out. The experienced officers were dead. The veteran pilots were gone. Fuel supplies were nearly empty. Then came the firebombing. American bombers began systematically destroying Japanese cities. Industrial centers were reduced to ash. Transportation networks were shattered. Food shortages spread quickly. The home islands were no longer safe. There was nowhere left to retreat. And yet, even at this stage, surrender was not automatic. The Japanese leadership was deeply divided. Some believed they should negotiate. Others believed they should fight to the end. The military culture had trained its officers to view surrender as dishonor. This is where the war reached its most tragic phase. The United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The destruction was unlike anything seen before. In seconds, entire cities were erased. Tens of thousands died instantly. Many more would die slowly in the weeks and months that followed. This was not just a military signal. It was a political one. It meant that the United States was no longer simply overpowering Japan. It was demonstrating that continuing the war meant the total annihilation of the nation. Only then did Japan's leadership confront the unavoidable truth. The war was not just lost. It had always been lost. Looking back, the attack on Pearl Harbor appears both logical and hopeless at the same time. It was logical in the sense that Japan was trapped. The oil embargo gave them a shrinking clock. Their navy would soon be immobilized. Their war in China could not continue without fuel. They faced the collapse of their military government if they admitted defeat. So they chose war. But it was a desperate war. It was a gamble against arithmetic. A gamble against manpower. A gamble against industrial reality. Yamamoto understood this. His private warnings were accurate. He believed he could give Japan 6 months of success. Maybe a year. After that, he expected disaster. History followed his prediction almost perfectly. Pearl Harbor was not simply a battle. It was a point of no return. It locked both nations into a conflict that only one side had the capacity to survive. So the final question remains a serious one, and it does not have an easy answer. Was Pearl Harbor a rational military calculation? Was it a desperate gamble by leaders with no good options left? Or was it strategic suicide from the very beginning? There are historians who argue all three. What is certain is this: Japan did not lose because it lacked courage, intelligence, or discipline. Japan lost because it attempted to fight an industrial superpower in a war of production, logistics, and replacement. When wars are decided by factories instead of generals, courage is not enough. Hope is not enough. Only mathematics remains. And the math was never in Japan's favor.